In 1843, 5 years before the publication of his infamous Communist Manifesto, German philosopher Karl Marx wrote to his local mayor for permission to move permanently to Texas. I promise this is real. I'm not making this up. But it is undoubtedly a really weird thing to consider, perhaps because it's interesting to think of how Marx's theory might have turned out differently had it been written by someone roaming the American West. What's particularly funny is that one of the things that Marx himself is most well known for is flipping the Hegelian dialectic, which, to put it simply, is placing an emphasis on ideas and ideologies as emanating from interacting material conditions. Culture, belief systems, ideas, all of these things were considered by Marx to be an inevitable objective consequence of their conditions. Nowadays, we tend to call this type of analysis dialectical materialism, and it's now considered a fundamental concept in modern-day politics, philosophy, and sociology. Of course, in the end, Marx would stay in Europe, so we can't really use Marxist theory as a case study for whether or not things would have changed. But almost 100 years earlier, we can find a good case study from a group of people who made the journey from Europe to the Gulf of Mexico and whose new conditions may have dramatically impacted that group's culture. They were Acadians. Once French settlers in Canada, they were forced out of Acadia when Britain took Quebec. A lot of the displaced Acadians would return to France briefly in the 1760s before taking the next opportunity to return to the New World, this time in the French colony of Louisiana 20 years later. Now referred to as the Cajuns, these people would come to develop a distinct culture, in particular regarding music, cuisine, and social practices. Cajun music is perhaps particularly interesting as a representation of a developed form of expression built distinctly from European roots, yet one which would come to grow apart and take its own form. So I guess the question that we're going to try and respond to today is the extent to which a dialectical materialist analysis can reveal anything about this divergence in musical tradition between something like this and something like this. We're going to be mentioning Marx, Derrida, and maybe even a little Deleuze, and we'll be focusing on divergence from 3 particular causes: instrumentation, commercial viability, and physical displacement. And we're going to illustrate to you how these factors change the course of Cajun music with a physical demonstration. My name is Abraham, and the following podcast is Cajun Music and Dialectical Materialism. Please enjoy.
Part 1, Instrumentation.
One of the most distinctive qualities of any musical tradition from around the world are the instruments used in the making of that music. Chances are you would probably be able to guess the region of the world that a piece of music came from within seconds of hearing a didgeridoo or a sitar or the djembe drum, and most of the time you might be right in your guess. You can think of instruments almost like lenses through which we can express ourselves musically, which filter that expression down into a certain range of potential sounds. And these are lenses which all too often reflect a shared intersubjectivity within the people group, a lens that has long been constructed and evolved over the tradition's history. The instrument is a cultural frame for musical expression. And hence, if we want to look at why a certain type of music sounds the way it does, the instruments that are used is inevitably going to play a large part in the discussion. Now, of course, we can't limit a geographical region or an entire tradition to the use of a single particular instrument. Plenty of music composed with different instrumentation can still be authentic to its stylistic tradition, and after all, blowing a vuvuzela at a football match doesn't automatically qualify you to be an authentic practitioner of Zulu music. But traditional instrumentations have a much deeper and more esoteric effect on a musical tradition. The techniques and protocols in music making that are developed and shared among a cultural group will often reflect the advantages, nuances, and limitations of the traditionally used instrumentation. Codes of music making, if they do develop, will reflect the material capacity of the instruments around which that culture has historically developed. And so, to take things back to the topic for today, Cajun music, we see a lot of the instrumentational limitations of the style's early formative years affecting the sound of the style even today. Do you notice how these all sound kind of familiar? Well, to give you a hint, they're all in C major, they're all based around one octave, and it's predominantly one melodic line used. Occasionally, you might get a piece of Cajun music in F major, but without the B flat, and here, a materialist explanation makes total sense in explaining why these aspects of Cajun music, tonal variety, orchestration, etc., sound the way they do. Going back into the history of the Cajuns, the diatonic accordion was the only instrument available for a long time capable of making a loud enough sound that they had access to. And that type of accordion that was available, you guessed it, was the one that was pitched to one octave around the C major scale. So remember the filter analogy we mentioned earlier? The musical expression of the early Cajuns was essentially filtered down by the material constraints of what they physically had available for musicking to this tonal framework. This was the start of the Cajun lens, as it were. This is the root from where Cajun musical technique first took form. This might be a difficult thing to get your head around, so I decided to try and illustrate the effect of working around a particular instrument within the little demonstration I composed. We tried to illustrate how the music made and inspired around a particular instrument can tether that music to a particular theme. Listen how the breakout group adopted its own musical identity when untethered from the line of the piano, in comparison to the dining room group. Instrumentation tethers tradition to a central fulcrum, revolving the process of music making around the accepted means to that end. In Deleuzian terms, we could even say that it defines territory by codifying its particular way of musicking into the culture's perception of music itself. So it's pretty clear, all things considered, that material circumstances can make a lasting impression on how a musical tradition gets going, the techniques it develops, and consequently the distinctive sounds we associate with that tradition. But there's one more thing we need to consider. If a dialectical materialist framework is to fit for explaining Cajun music, we must also consider the question as to whether the diatonic nature of the Cajun accordion is also possible to derive from the material conditions of its creation. But again, the argument for influence of material conditions here is pretty strong. Diatonic accordions are considerably smaller and lighter than more complex accordions, as the instrument requires only one reed instead of two, and 4 buttons instead of 8 keys, but can still play upbeat and lively folk rhythms nonetheless. As a result, it's no surprise which type were able to be more easily transported to Louisiana en masse. Materially speaking, the adoption and importation of the diatonic accordion, which in turn would shape the foundations of Cajun musical tradition, were clearly more likely, pragmatic, and more, how might I say, economical.
Part 2. Commercial Viability.
Welcome to America, the cultural melting pot of the world. If you want your niche cultural style to survive and prosper, it'll have to learn to compete the way all other styles do, on the free market. Most recently, we could talk about neoliberalism and the Fukuyamaite premise that we've reached the end of history and can let the market make all our decisions now. But honestly, we don't need to. Cajun music gives us an example of the necessity to juggle an appeal to market forces long before the days of neoliberal hegemony. You know, back when history was still going. The influence of commercial viability on Cajun music first probably emerged in the former half of the 20th century, paralleling the rise of the electrical era of sound recording. Making music for recording would allow the Cajun music tradition to proliferate amongst newly emerging elements to American working class life, such as the radio. But in doing so, the environment of the recording studio allowed for the exploration of entirely new dynamics and arrangements for Cajun music. While during this period, from 1928 to 34, the majority of recordings stayed largely true to the tradition of the acoustic accordion ensemble, the latching of Cajun music onto commercially successful styles such as swing would see these new explorations and variations of Cajun music soar to prominence in the 30s and 40s, as of the increasing prescience of mass media to the lives of ordinary Cajun Americans. The introduction of more varied orchestration, in particular the steel guitar and the drum kit, would see Cajun musicians incorporate elements from popular rock, blues, and jazz music styles into the post-war era. We could therefore say that the development and direction of the Cajun music tradition throughout the 20th century saw heavy influence from market forces, from the state of the new musical economy that had emerged from music's increasing position as a commodity to be bought and sold on a market model. The need to work in this additional criteria of finding a place on the market was something we tried to illustrate for the breakout group in our demonstration. Instead of commercial viability, however, it was a bathroom fan that the breakout group had to find a way to work into their own improvisation, influencing how their riffing ended up sounding. So again, the material conditions of a merciless capitalist economy seem to be yet another factor that shaped Cajun music. Yet again, materialism provides a good framework for analyzing this. To bring in Deleuze again, capitalism is a major force of and recoding the stuff we do, musical culture included. In a capitalist society, the market will shape the music, just as it would orient any other marketable commodity. And we see this exemplified upon the trajectory of Cajun music's development into what it is now over the course of the 20th century.
Part 3. Displacement.
So you want to know why I really wrote this demonstration that I keep bringing up? Well, frankly, it's here to mimic one particular phenomenon above all others, the cultural divergence emerging from physical displacement. It may seem slightly obvious, but a large part of why Cajun and French musical traditions would gradually grow apart was that Cajun and French literally were on opposing sides of the Atlantic Ocean, and this was before the internet or commercial flight. The Cajuns and their cousins back in Europe were therefore in distinct forums in which ideas would resonate. Again, this may sound a bit abstract at first, so let's apply it to the example of our little demonstration. When we all started out in the dining room together, our makeshift Europe perhaps, all performers were in the same room, listening to the same people, and building our improvisational contributions to the music being made out from the same body of ideas. But when the group splits and a few headed off to America/the bathroom, suddenly the breakaway group are no longer party to the developments or ideas emerging in the dining room, and vice versa. Culture's kinda like a massive inside joke. It's a shared understanding, story, or idea that we share with each other because of, for one, physical proximity, and for two, the similarity in our material conditions and experiences. When the breakout group leaves the dining room, or the Cajuns leave the continent, those remaining will continue to develop their own inside jokes, i.e. musical technique, forms of expression, so forth. And the displaced will do so as well, but because the two groups are now physically disconnected, the chances that they'll form the exact same inside jokes grows slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. And it's here where we see perhaps the largest difference between Marx's dialectical materialism and other materialist perspectives such as pure empiricism or logical positivism. Marx does understand and acknowledge that material conditions aren't reacted to objectively, but are subject to variations in perception. Marx recognizes the impact of what we've been calling the inside joke, which in its Marxian terminology would be called ideology. But Marx remains materialist because his dialectical model poses ideology as a synthesis of preceding material conditions. In other words, that ideology, that way of musicking, it's not abstract. It itself is the inevitable product of the conditions from which it arose. Underneath every ideology, every idea, there is an interaction between material conditions from which that idea derives. But here's some more context about the demonstration we did. The breakaway group in the performance was just me and my dad. Now, as a gut reaction, and maybe you came to the same conclusion as a listener, I fail to believe that the ideas, the improvisations that we created in that bathroom together was some formulaic result of underlying material conditions. And Marx would probably say that sure, maybe the improvisation we made seems partially arbitrary and illogical, but there is a layered material logic to everything we sang, just so deeply layered that we might not ever be able to fully chart it. And I guess we can't exactly disprove that easily, unless we turn to deconstruction. Time to introduce Jacques Derrida, the man probably most notably associated with deconstruction. Derrida gives us an interesting experiment that shines light upon the extent to which we can communicate with any objectivity. If I, say, had a picture in my head and wished to convey it exactly to you, whatever words I might happen to pick, the reception and interpretation of my words on your end won't be able to get across that same picture, making communication without any reliance on subjective interpretation impossible. And if we cannot objectively communicate, it is hence impossible for us to gauge objective perception, as we cannot therefore gain an objective point of reference to assess against our own variable sensory perception. And if perception too is inevitably tainted by a subjectivity that we can't externally reflect upon, then the notion of ideology deriving objectively from material conditions is consequently nullified. All perception and response to conditions must logically be preceded by subjective interpretation. Subjectivity must precede objectivity. So the idea that some material objectivity is responsible for the form taken by any ideology, the premise of dialectical materialism, just simply is incompatible. And this is the element in which dialectical materialism fails as a framework for analysing the divergence taken by Cajun music. Sure, it can provide many interesting and pertinent reflections on aspects such as instrumentation and commercial viability, but the music created by Joe Falcone or Blind Uncle Gaspard or the Hackberry Ramblers, Beau Soleil, Steve Riley, so many other Cajun musicians came from their unique subjective perception and the subjective manner in which they responded to that perception musically. We cannot decode musical creativity to any formula of reductive determinism, for subjectivity is destined to precede whatever initial objective conditions Marx may insist exist. Dialectical materialism is a fascinating model through which to understand the world, the development of cultures and traditions included, but like any other analytical model, it can no longer be tenably considered universal truth, and will consequently never show us a fully definitive picture as to the precise ways in which Cajun music took its own path. That fully complete picture, perhaps, may prove forever unattainable. And for those who are watching this, if I make this video public, incidentally, this is a similar argument to the one I made about the Vorsch non-compete debate, so if you want to watch that, the link is in the description. Professors, you're not supposed to understand that reference, so I'm not counting it in the word count. I am, have been, and will continue to be Abraham Leonard Keefe. Good night.